It is now 17 minutes after 7. You're watching Morning Express, and it's time for us to look at the weekend review and review what has been happening over the week. I'll welcome you to participate in this conversation. You're welcome to, and you can do that via Twitter. The Twitter handles are going to be displayed as we carry on with the conversation. I'll see whether in between we can just look at your communication and your input in the conversation as we carry on. But I'll introduce the guests and the panelists that we have here this morning, starting with my extreme left, where we have Kevin Osido, who's a governance specialist. Good morning and thank you for joining us.
Sir, thank you.
We also have Mark Bichachi, who's also a political analyst and governance specialist. Thank you for joining us. Last but not least, we have Professor Oeri Tumbo, who is a political analyst. Karibu sana. Thank you for joining us. And we'll start with what has, well, been a big story, not just in Kenya and in Africa, but worldwide. And this is to do with popularly known as Uncle Bob, Robert Mugabe. There, well, has been developments there, and we do know that the military took over in what is being called in some quarters a soft coup. What is unique about it is that normally a coup, characteristically, is one that gets you by surprise, and is not normally one that you negotiate. But this one seems, Zimbabwe seems to be taking a different way for it. And maybe just to start it with your opening remarks, let me start with you, Mark, on your thoughts on Zimbabwe's situation.
I think Zimbabwe's situation is quite interesting. Number one, let's remember that this is quite a popular move in Zimbabwe, that what the army has done has actually reflected what a lot of Zimbabweans have wished for a very long time. Secondly, you have to remember the geopolitical nature of Southern Africa. First of all, Mugabe represents the coalition of SWAPO, ANC, ZANU-PF, and all these pro-independence parties that worked together in the 80s and 90s to bring about independence from white rule. Therefore, Mugabe's position has always been held together by the Jacob Zumas and Thabo Mbekis of the day, who supported him, because remember, before he was Uncle Bob, he was always Comrade Bob, and that comradeship is what has held them together. Now, what is also the problem for the organizers of the coup is that coups are generally not popular on this side of history. Post-20, after the Libyan and the Egyptian revolt, the coups have not been seen to be cures to political problems. So therefore, I think what they're trying to do, and this is going to be very interesting to watch, this is going to be the first negotiated coup you've ever had, where I have a gun to your head and I'm negotiating with you. So it's very interesting how it's going to play out. I think it's going to be a case study for history. Will it give Mugabe a chance to reorganize and bounce back, or will he indeed resign? So it's going to be one of those things that we'll have to check out. And for us communication strategists, it's going to be very interesting to see how this transition is managed and communicated.
All right, Prof, you're well versed in matters governance and history of Africa, and specifically Rhodesia, which now is Zimbabwe. Your thoughts on how things have developed so far?
Thank you, Mike. Now, in Mugabe's case, or in the Zimbabwean situation, personally, I regret that it's come to this, because Bob Mugabe really grew up in the trenches for Zimbabwean independence. He had an extremely good ride in the first 20 years, after which it appeared like he had overstayed his welcome. And he overstayed purely because of what my colleague calls the comradeship. You know, it was really a regional sort of group that was struggling to liberate the South African and Central African area of the continent. Now, what makes Mugabe's situation complicated is not what they do outside Zimbabwe, it's internal. You know, in Zimbabwe, Mugabe is together with his colleagues, the people they fought in the trenches. Incidentally, they are nearly all from the same ethnic group. They are all Shonas. Now, so they are relatives, so to speak. Is like in Kenya, having Kikuyus among themselves, negotiating whether X stays or he goes. Or in Kalenjin land, they're negotiating who stays and who goes. My take on this is that for Uncle Bob, the goose is cooked. I do not, and this is
your personal
my personal opinion, I do not see him negotiating a stay at 93.
But well, it was rumored that he was to give a press statement yesterday and step down, which is part of the negotiations, according to some political pundits. But given the delay, and there are pictures already going around with Uncle Bob looking, you know, like he's well, he's smiling and everything, but it seems like he may not be taking that option. Again, not forgetting Uncle Bob is well known for doing things completely differently and being radical.
There is always a first time, Mike. There's always a first time for any of these things that have not happened before. It's a classic case of mismanaged succession. Here is a case...
Mismanaged coup.
A mismanaged succession in his case. This is not a mismanaged coup. What has happened is that Mnangagwa was basically, in terms of the comrade structure, he was next in line. But Grace is trying to disrupt.
Grace is trying to do what Bathsheba did in crowning Solomon,
yes, so
except there is no Solomon. She wants to be queen.
So she wants to disrupt that structure. And what the younger people in that structure are saying, even if it was not Mnangagwa, it can't be Grace. It should be one of us. So what we are dealing with is a problem that is internally fairly complicated. But my take on it is that the other people are worried they might overstay. So, and therefore, miss the train.
All right.
So the likelihood is that they are going to push and push and push. And my guess is that Uncle Bob will have to go.
Will have to go. Kevin, I don't know if you have the same opinion that Uncle Bob will have to go, or might he manage to somehow, this being a negotiation, get himself back to power? I'm not sure whether Grace would be an option, but if he comes back to power, then he has the full control of what happens to ZANU-PF starting with. And secondly, he could have influence on the elections which are supposed to take taking place sometime next year.
One of the things that more or less in Africa and precisely Southern African nations have been able to do for our continent is to present institutions that can be able to work. And what I mean by this is looking at the political party development processes in Southern Africa, which are much more different from what we see in Eastern, Central, and other parts of Africa, Northern and all that. And what this means to me is you look at the ability, for instance, for ANC in South Africa to be able to have a say in who becomes the nation's president, and that if you do not perform as per our expectations, then we can be able to recall you and send you home. We've seen that happen with former President Thabo Mbeki. The same is not new for Zimbabwe, and that is why, in my view, I think and believe probably that the reason why this is being done in a much more softer way is to be able to give the institutions a space for them to be able to be seen to be working. And I am very sure that the defense forces of Zimbabwe had the option to just decide to get radical and get what they want, which I do not think is what their history and their institutions therefore present for. And so, by and large, I do not see Uncle Bob staying longer. But for me, the bigger question then that this presents is the place of the youth bulge and the younger population, like you rightfully said. And probably, as Professor said earlier on, did it really have to get to this after 34 years? And you could be able to tell that the economic indicators of Zimbabwe were really dwindling day by day. You could be able to tell that the social structures of Zimbabwe, which in my view, other than Namibia and Botswana, probably for the southern part of Africa, then presents the next country where if things are not working in South Africa, for example, looking at xenophobic radical activities taking place in the country, then people would then want to move to either of the three countries. So Zimbabwe, in my view, then presents that softer landing ground for other people who would probably feel disenfranchised and then would be looking for a place to be able to rest. But therefore, the political occurrences that are taking place right now then would also push people who need to say certain things to that level of managing this transition. I would call it a transition because I think and believe that Zimbabwe, after all these years with Uncle Bob, then begins to ask themselves these hard questions. Is this the kind of life that you want to live? what is our next way out of this political crisis. And so I think that the younger generation and the populace, and then presents the question of mentorship for young people. Even here in Kenya, we had President Moi for 24 years, and you saw in 2002 when people said, we think it's enough is enough, and so we began to see transitions and strengthening of institutions, both political parties, the judiciary, parliament, National Assembly, and Senate, now for our devolved, rather new governance system. And so I think that these are some of the lessons, despite the fact that Zimbabwe has had this much more of a developed growth of political institutions, much more than Kenya. But then looking at lessons that countries or nations can learn from each other in Africa, I think that Zimbabwe presents a case study of what we can be able to pick up from and what other lessons, what other countries can be able to learn in terms of dealing with I've had people call him an octogenarian, but I don't know whether I really want to say that. But then, of course, yeah, leaders who stay longer in power, and Uganda is not very far from what we probably could be discussing.
All right, and Prof, your thoughts on the fact that coups at some point were very common in Africa to remove a leader who was not viewed to be popular or who had overstayed their welcome. However, there seems to be a change. And this change, if you look at, for instance, Rwanda, dancing around the constitution and changing it, where Kagame by now was supposed to have left office, but the constitution was changed. We also have DRC doing the same thing, where Kabila's term had reached, but they also danced around the constitution and kind of, played around with things here and there to a point where they're still in leadership. But we see now Zimbabwe still trying what we'd call the old-fashioned coup, but regenerating it to a negotiated coup. Coups have always been known to be, first of all, a huge surprise to whoever it is that is being taken out of office. Secondly, they're non-negotiable. It's normally the military saying, this is what is going to happen, this is what we have done. So your thoughts on that particular dynamics change in Africa?
Thank you, Mike. Initially, from an African perspective, when coups were staged, they were a primary struggle to control resources, control power and control resources. Sometimes, irrespective of how well a guy was doing, people felt that at that particular point in time, it was not being done in the interest of the public. It was being done in the interest of cliques, groups, striving to control power and resources. So gradually, they became unpopular because every time guys got into power, they did their own thing. They had nothing to do with the people. They had nothing to do with improving the lives of the people, better distribution of resources, and forming a social contract with the population. It was simply self-service. That was partially the reason why they became unpopular. Now, there is an inherent problem in any place where there is a coup. The inherent problem is, do the institutions serve the public, or institution serve the individuals? Any time you smell a coup, there is self-service at the center of it, so that instead of people dancing around institutions to strengthen them, they turn it around. Institutions are made to dance around individuals. And as long as that is the practice, if you look at Rwanda, for example, the people have been made to believe that everything done is in their interest. And to a certain extent, yes. Now, as a result, the political structure is being manipulated, all right, to fit the people who are in power. And that's what I said, that people make institutions dance around them. Now, there are situations like what you see in Uganda. I am actually one of those suffering from emotional injury, because when Museveni got into power, he was the young guy of our time. He was the blue-eyed boy of the new African, political intellectual. Now, after 20, 25, 30 years in power, the guy sounds more backward than the people he was criticizing at the time he took power. So the issue is that in all these things, until coups represent aspirations of the people. They're nearly all self-serving enterprises.
All right. Mark, your thoughts on that change of tactic by African leaders to stay in power by now using the constitution, which would probably be trying to work within the confines of the law, as it were?
It's interesting, and I think Museveni would best be served to learn from Mugabe, because Mugabe's coup, as organized by his generals, is very interesting. Mugabe stood on the strength of ZIPRA and ZAPU, which was the military wing of ZANU-PF, okay? Now, Mnangagwa and the current army general were part of Mugabe's troop in the trenches. They fought together. Okay? When Mugabe needed to intimidate voters, it is the same Mnangagwas and the rest who were used to intimidate voters. So in other words, Mugabe's power stood on the shoulder of the giant that was ZAPU and ZIPRA. Okay? Now, understanding that, it means that if Museveni thinks that a constitutional change will afford him to stay in power forever, he needs to remember what keeps him in power. And what keeps him in power is his use of the police and the military to suppress dissent. Now, the day he crosses those same people is the day he will be overthrown. That is from the example in Zimbabwe. Why? Because when you block out every opportunity for people to negotiate or to ventilate a way out of your rulership, then what happens is the opposition comes internally. Because what you automatically create as a dictator is you create people who are looking for you to die, collapse, be sick, and for them to take over. So the moment you threaten the opportunity to take over, and that the people you use to keep you in power, they'll use that same power you've given them to overthrow you. And Museveni has an interesting tangent. We've seen him doing the same thing that Mugabe has done for a while, where he's trying to get his family. Okay, his son is now very senior within the military. He's tried to use his wife, she's very active in government, to get himself elected longer and longer. Right. Now, the reality is there are people who are looking at Museveni and thinking, you know, in 10 years, I can be president. So the danger is not the people who, it's not the Morgan Tsvangirais, it's not Kiza Besigye. That's not who your threat is, because you've trained yourself to fight them. Your actual threat is inside. That's why the Swahili said, Kikulacho kinguoni mwako. So whatever is in the cloth of this despot is what they should be worried about.
I want us to come to Kenya now, but before we do that, because this will also weigh in on our Kenyan situation, looking at leadership and the fact that we seem to have leaders who never envisage themselves leaving office, such that you never train. I mean, even in a normal family setup, any businessman would probably want to train their son to take over. But when it comes to governance, we seem not to have that culture in our African setup. And even when we look at our political situation in Kenya and our political parties right now, or political formations, there seem to be one supremo who's all-powerful, and if you try to identify protege, somebody he's training or grooming, there doesn't seem to be anything like that. Kevin?
Mike, from a governance perspective, this is really telling, and probably I need to begin presenting it from the grassroots level, because you many times do not see, beyond elections, the populace or the citizens feel that our work is already done, and that whoever gets into office knows why she is getting in there. And so it no longer ceases to be our business to even follow up, to even want to do accountability issues, to even want to monitor or evaluate projects which are then presented to us as either manifestos or blueprints from governments that have already been put in office. And so, and then the next thing, of course, is working institutions. And that institutions of this nature, and probably in relations to what's happening to Mugabe, you know that again, Africa Union has presented Mugabe as the spokesperson of the continent. And that is something that also needs to be really put into consideration. But then you don't see mentorship and leadership taking place from the perspective of how do we move from where we already are. And that's why in the case of Zimbabwe, I also brought in the perspective of Africa's growing youth bulge. Because in Kenya, for example, every year we churn out more than 800,000 young people from our institutions of higher learning. But look at what is happening in our universities. KU was burning last night. Reasons, very simple things that need to be dealt with. Daystar has been, you know, one of those universities quite progressive in nature, but look at systems just failing to be able to work to present what then the grassroots, the citizens, the people are feeling. And what this presents is, in my view, a suppression of values, a suppression of expectations of the citizens. And so people feel that the person who is supposed to be in office and is meant to be delivering certain aspirations is actually ending up disenfranchising our own visions and dreams. Now, this presents, therefore, an opportunity for people to begin coming up. But we all know that, for instance, in African political democracies or democratic progression, it's very difficult for anyone to just come from the villages and say you want to be an MCA or you want to be a governor or you want to be a president of whatsoever nature. You must really wield lots of economic power. You must be politically accepted. And that is why, even from the business perspective, you said a progressive businessman would want to bring in a son, his son, to be able to be groomed. We don't see that happening in Africa, really, because, and hence the reason why, in my view, I think that Africa needs to begin to rethink our growth process in the sense that, are there things that we are learning from the mistakes that we have made in the past? And to be honest with you, I do not think that we are learning, because if, for instance, the case of Zimbabwe right now, if we were able to see any young person that is coming up who is not necessarily from your very close family, like a son, a wife, or whatsoever, then the institutions, like the political parties, need to begin to groom up people. And the failure of that is evident even in Kenya, where KANU did not groom up anyone. So for 24 years, we had to go to the streets and say in 2002, enough is enough. Look at President Uhuru Kenyatta, for instance. Whoever knew? But you see, again, it's about the political systems that KANU was there, and KANU felt that we are entitled to be in power. So we need to begin to bring up our own.
Yes,
you know, one of the things that we need to consider in Africa is that we never talk about death. A leader never dies. If you went to your father today and
culturally in Africa, death, you know, is a taboo to talk about. Exactly. It's almost like you're bringing it.
Yeah. if today you went to your father and you said, Dad, you know, we need to arrange for your funeral, he'd be thinking, are you planning to murder me? So the culture of the African, and this is true for most African continents, is that a leader is eternal. That is our imagination. We imagine that we never talk about tomorrow. And it's also the reason why corruption exists. Because the African is trained by tradition to live for the now and to live for the moment. And because I think, this is a thought, it is not based on fact. I think because we grew up in an environment where fruit grows on trees and you didn't plant the tree. And you know you can get your vegetables and the antelope can run into your house. So we grew up in an environment where the now was what all we thought about. So there's no investment in a lot of African countries about the future. We do not think about what happens if so-and-so dies, how do we inherit. In fact, part of the reason the Kenyan Constitution is so powerful, and I learned this when I attended the presidential inauguration in Ghana. Do you know that they had not figured out how to properly transit? So on January 3rd, the morning of January 4th, they had for 6 hours a period where no one was president. Because the presidency was dissolved at midnight and the swearing-in ceremony was at 10 in the morning. Why? Because we do not think about handing over, we don't think about the next generation, and every leader is afraid of dying.
Prof, and I want us to now come back home, because I want us to focus on our political arrangements. And for example, we have Baba coming back home today, and there's euphoria about it. And whether he has the solution and the key for Kenya is another debate. But the question is, if you look at NASA, for example, if you look at Jubilee, look at Third Way Alliance, all of them, you see the leader, but we don't seem to see a protege. We don't seem to see somebody who's being groomed such that not even in the case of death. Death is even extreme. In the case that one even wanted to retire, you can literally say, I'm handing over to so-and-so. They have proved that they understand governance, they understand the ideology of the party, and are ready to take over.
Actually, Mike, the problem we have is much bigger than we perceive. First and foremost, all of us, the people in the African environment, all our thinking, all our operations around physical things. Physical things, you know. I have a chair I sit in, I'm the boss. I have a big car I sit in, I'm the boss. I have a big office, I'm the boss. This is our concept of power. Now, the soft aspects of it, soft exercise of power, authority, influence, and all that goes with it. We're in a permanent state of transition.
Yes.
We are transiting from being what Bichachi was just describing, being watching the antelope and other things. We are transiting from there. We are trying to become like France, like US, but we have not quite understood what structures enable those systems to operate. What is the software that facilitates those institutions to do the things? You see, you're talking about succession. Now, what is the meaning of succession to the African person in power? The meaning of of succession, all right, of the African in power is that his system for abusing the public opportunities been given is going to be disrupted.
Yes.
It is not that he has had a privilege to serve, and therefore he has done something that he would like to bequeath to the next generation. So my understanding of this thing, Mike, is that we don't understand power in the modern context on how you, in other words, to put it in political terms, we don't understand statecraft.
All right, Kevin, can we simply describe power in Africa and even in Kenya in one word and call it simply selfish? Would that be an accurate description?
Not really. Why I say so is because, again, from a governance perspective, African nations are different. And for instance, you probably look at, for Kenya, you have devolved governance, which is, of course, almost similar to what's happening in Nigeria and probably in certain other countries. And so if you look at, the other thing is the governance, not governance, but leadership systems, or rather political systems. You have nations or countries in Africa that exercise parliamentary system, and others do presidential. Now, what this, in my view, means is that you have to get to a point where the voice of the people is made to count, that it can be able to count beyond just elections. And so it would be very difficult to say that Africa power is just selfish, because again, you can be able to mention certain countries in Africa whose presidents or whose leaders have been able to perform, and the people have asked them to actually even want to stay for some more time in power. And countries like Botswana, you know, Botswana
but that goes back to my previous sentiment, whereby even if you have done well, shouldn't you have been mentoring somebody who can even take it to another level? Because what happens is that, yes, you have done well. For instance, when Museveni came into power, he did well for some time. Look at Paul Kagame. He literally transformed the country. But at some point, we don't seem to get the timing right of when to exit.
Exactly. That is very true. And hence, the question of who do you mentor and how do you mentor? And Mike, this is quite fascinating because in Kenya, for example, our political structure allows for youth leagues and women leagues within political parties. But these are people who are more or less just like flower girls. I'm saying this because I have been part of a youth league of a political party in this country.
You are flower girl.
Well, and security, you know, providers and marshals for politicians and, you know, goons for hire and all that. And so it therefore becomes very difficult. In fact, for Kenya, when you are much more of a Julius Malema of ANC South Africa in Kenya, then you become a threat to either your party leader or you're the big boss in the political space. So this, in my view, therefore presents an opportunity for young people, both women and men, the youth, to be able to begin crafting our own narrative around what power and politics mean for us. And this can be done both at the national and even at the county level for the case of Kenya. And then be able to present workable options and recommendations for both politics and governance.
All right, Prof, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I was just, sorry to, I'm just worried. It doesn't appear clear as to why people look for power.
That's why I describe it as selfish, because other than self-accumulation, self-actualization, and them and their cronies, what other reason really is there for power? It's not for the people by the looks of it. Actually,
I was going to disagree with him that he said it's not for selfish reasons. I have yet, and I've been around quite a bit, I've yet to see the people who espouse the interest of the voter being given a chance to promote the interest of the voter. What we have in our Kenyan system, for example, is a master-servant relationship. The voter is a servant, the politician is the master.
Mheshimiwa.
Mheshimiwa. So that even if a person is an established, almost professional criminal, we still purport that he's an Aishimiwa.
One of the things that, and let me quote something from the Bible. It says when a king surrounds himself with falsehood and allows people to lie to him, then his servants become wicked, which is what we've seen a lot of time in African countries. Now, here's the problem. The biggest problem with how we approach leadership is the closer you get to your leader, the more stupid you're supposed to become. That's the African model. So you find the people closest to the leader don't think at all. So you find the person farthest away from power is thinking the most, as opposed to what is called an advisor to the power. That's the first problem. And that comes from the structure of how African thinking is based. Because even our children, they're not allowed to give opinions. Our children are not, children are supposed to be seen and not heard. And this culture then comes up where we call our leaders Baba, and then everyone else, therefore, is Mtoto. Okay? So if we are all children, then we are all to be seen and not to be heard. Now, there's another funny game that we play in Kenya specifically that is very interesting. You see, the ascension of someone like Juju Malema is thanks to the strength of a party called ANC. Why? Because when a party is established and is strong, then democratic systems have to happen within the party. Okay? So what needs to happen is, because of time, you have to have a new person at the polling station, new person at the ward, new person at the county level, new person at the constituency. Therefore, there is a path to the top of the party. In Kenya, what we do is we've formed new parties every so often. And when you form a new party, it becomes yours. Because I will sit with my friends here and we'll say solidarity together. I'll be chairman, he'll be vice chairman, and he's secretary general. And then we do that every 5 years. What is important for this country to do? Number one, we need to stop having small personal parties and move into the structure of bigger political parties that last longer than an election period. It is very critical because, and I'll give an example of Jubilee Party, this is the hope that Jubilee should be able to do. If they don't do this, they failed already. They need to be able, if they have the numbers they have in parliament, then what they need to do is create a funnel for young people to be able to participate in the politics of Jubilee, and not just in terms of the youth wing or the women's wing, but the real party organization from constituency all the way to national level. That they will have a Congress where they actually democratically select their representatives. Right. If that is possible for either coalition in this country, then there's a funnel for success.
We need to take a short break, so I'll ask you to be brief, Kevin, on that. And now we're on political parties locally. Yes,
I just wanted to bring in the aspect of strengthening institutions. And hence why I said earlier on that for Kenya, we really need to move from personifying political parties to having institutionalized parties, because then that is where the answer lies. And what institutions do is that you have frameworks that guide operations, which are either MOUs, which are either constitutions, which will be able to tell you that as you're coming in as a chairman of this small group of ours, you will have a one term which is renewable. So after 4 years, which is 2-year term, you quit. And that gives the institution, the party, or the company an opportunity to, you know, churn out much more people who then can be able to learn from your mistakes.
And it forces you to mentor and groom
exactly.
people. Yes, because
exactly.
there's a path, there's a predictable path that has
exactly.
to be followed. Professor, you wanted to weigh in on that.
Actually, I have a problem with that because that is theoretically possible. But practically, this fellow you have put in power, all right, uses the party as a special purpose vehicle for his own interest and his cronies. What happens then in a system, and this special purpose vehicle is designed around an ethnic branch, all right? It is not around principles. You see, what you are describing is what is designed around principles. This one is designed around...
And that is why, Prof, I agree with you fully, that for as long as a party remains in Western Kenya, in Ukambani, to me, to be honest with you, that's not a political party. It's a tribal grouping.
You see, as far as I'm concerned, I agree with you. I think we agree.
Yes.
The issue I'm trying to deal with is that once you've got a special purpose vehicle that is sitting on an ethnic branch, all right, the rules and regulations and values and systems don't actually apply.
Mike,
the reason being, before you proceed, is that if you want to apply those, then the people who are ethnically close to the owner of the SPV will not allow it. So the issue becomes, right? Your interest, not your values, your interest in terms of controlling part of the political estate against mine.
And that takes me to just being selfish, literally.
Let me tell you.
I need to take a break. Yes, Kevin,
yes,
very briefly.
You see, the beauty of institutions and systems is that, for example, in Kenya, we have things that guide how we operate. For you to register a political party in this country, you must have physical presence in at least half of the 47 counties. We don't see that happening.
Which is an office of 5,000 shillings that no one opens.
Exactly, and you don't see that happening, and yet we still continue to register these parties. So the point is, why should we have them in black and white, but we can't have them in blue or green, which means we cannot be able to implement them. It means that the institution, like the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties, is not doing what it is supposed to be doing, because otherwise, over time, I have prayed, and I am really longing for a time when in Kenya we shall just have two parties that are as powerful and can be able to represent the aspirations, the dreams of Kenyans, and are not necessarily region-clouded cocoons or ethnicized bodies, you know?
All right, and hopefully that's one of the things we could discuss and look at when we come back again, given that we have the Supreme Court petition that wound up yesterday, and we're expecting a ruling by latest Monday. And the truth of the matter is, regardless of the ruling, Kenya still has a huge dialogue that we need to have. And maybe two political parties might be a solution. Who has that answer? We're going to be discussing that right here on Morning Express when we come back. For now, we want to take a short break, and as we do that, we want to release KTN Home for Life and Style to begin. And those of us on KTN News will be right back and wind up on the week review. But those of us on KTN Home, we take this opportunity to wish you a fantastic and a great weekend. Enjoy yourselves on Life and Style as it begins in just a bit.